I was scrolling through the comments section the other day, and I found one that just really stopped me in my tracks. It started with this incredibly confident, almost arrogant academic pronouncement.
Oh, yeah. What did it say?
It declared, to read Marx's theory without first reading Aristotle's Politics is academically irresponsible. Okay, I thought, a pretty strong take, maybe a bit elitist, but hey, not the strangest thing you see online. I was ready to just scroll past.
Right, standard academic gatekeeping, maybe.
Exactly. But then it just veered into this completely unexpected territory. This same commenter, right after that, went on to claim that most modern Marxists are just sociopathic opportunists looking for status.
Oh, okay. That's quite elite.
And that their activism, it's actually controlled dissent that helps the oligarchy because it's designed to be easily dismantled.
Controlled dissent. Okay, so it's not real resistance in their view.
Apparently not. And just when I thought, okay, I think I have a handle on this weird argument, the final twist came. The solution wasn't democracy. It wasn't revolution.
What was it then?
The commenter argued that what we should really be aiming for is just a more functional and less oppressive form of oligarchy.
Better oligarchs.
Yeah.
Seriously,
this whole mix, this jump from, classical philosophy to this scathing critique of the left to a full-on, pessimistic embrace of better oligarchs, I just had to stop and stare. It wasn't left-wing, it wasn't right-wing, it was just this bizarre, intricate, and deeply cynical argument I couldn't ignore.
Wow, that comment is, well, it's a masterpiece of intellectual audacity, maybe. Yeah. And deep cynicism, absolutely. It compresses centuries of political philosophy, critical theory, neo-authoritarian critique, all into one very provocative thesis.
Really, it's a lot.
Yeah. So our mission today, I think, has to be a deep dive into these three radical sort of interlinked claims. We need to unpack this complex material, this convergence of classical ethics, the diagnosis of, entrenched oligarchy, and this strain of neo-authoritarian politics, just to understand the intellectual structures that, prop up this pessimism.
Makes sense.
This material is complex, no doubt about it. But exploring it feels essential for really grasping the arguments that are actively shaping political thought right now. You hear echoes of this stuff.
Absolutely. Okay, let's start at the beginning then, with that audacious academic imperative. The claim that reading Marxist theory without Aristotle's Politics is, quote, academically irresponsible. It's such an aggressive demand almost that modern political critique must be grounded in classical philosophy. Why is that connection supposedly so vital?
Well, the connection isn't just incidental, you see. It's presented as foundational. If you treat Marx only as, say, an economist or a historian, you basically miss the profound ethical condemnation that's driving his work.
Ah, okay.
The assertion is that Marx's critique of capitalism isn't simply about economic inequality or class exploitation. Those are symptoms, right?
Right, the surface level stuff.
Exactly. The real philosophical condemnation of the system, the deep critique, rests heavily on Aristotelian principles. Specifically, the concept of eudaemonia.
Eudaemonia, human flourishing, that idea.
Precisely, human flourishing. So the critique isn't fundamentally about whether people have enough money, though that's part of it, but whether capitalism itself prevents them from realizing their full human potential, their essence.
So you're saying Marx's philosophical case requires this kind of classical humanist lens?
I think that's the argument being made, yes. For him, the core moral good is the unalienated development and manifestation of human capacities. This ideal state, it's defined by what Aristotle also prioritized. Spontaneous, self-directed, purposive activity. A life lived according to one's own chosen ends.
Okay. And the flip side.
Conversely, the fundamental moral evil, the real tragedy of capitalism in this view, is avoidable alienation. This self-estrangement from one's own human essence, or what Marx called species being.
That really sharpens the distinction between Marx and, say, more standard liberal critics. It definitely elevates the discussion from just needing reforms to, a moral battle over the very definition of a well-lived life.
It absolutely does. Both thinkers, Marx and Aristotle, they emphasize this distinctively human ability to rationally, purposively plan one's life through choice. And they both fundamentally reject a life where your actions are just, determined by external forces outside your control.
Which is how capitalism is framed here.
Exactly. Consider the proletariat under capitalism. They sell their labor power as a commodity, not because they find that activity fulfilling in itself, but strictly as a necessary means to obtain basic necessities. survival.
All right.
So their daily existence, their creative output, it's largely determined by these indifferent external forces of the market and the basic need to survive.
Their entire work life, their productive existence, is essentially instrumentalized. It's not an end in itself, just a tool to get something else.
Exactly, which runs directly counter to that Aristotelian idea that the best life consists of activities engaged in for their own sakes, intrinsic value. Marx captured this tragedy quite poignantly, I think, by observing that the worker feels at home only during his leisure, whereas at work he feels homeless.
Homeless at work.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It is. That lack of spontaneity, the instrumentalization of life, it's seen as fundamentally non-flourishing and therefore morally repugnant if it's imposed by a social structure that could theoretically be different. An avoidable structure.
So the demand for Aristotle first is really a demand to ground the critique in human nature itself, not just in political economy or historical circumstance.
That seems to be the core of that first claim. It sets a very high philosophical bar for the critique.
Okay, that deep dive into alienation definitely clarifies the moral basis. But let's move to the second element you mentioned earlier, how this classical lens informs Marx's really radical critique of distributive justice and equality. Specifically, how he seems to tear down the liberal concept of equal rights. Yes, this is a really complex point, but it's one where you can see that classical influence shining through again, particularly in Marx's critique of the Goethe program. He argues there that the bourgeois concept of equal rights is itself inherently flawed. It's actually a subtle form of alienation, in his view, because it fails what you might call the test of moral uniqueness.
How so? The defect lies in applying an equal standard to unequal individuals. Wait, isn't equality the goal? Why is applying an equal standard a defect? That sounds counterintuitive.
It does initially, but think about it. To apply that single equal standard, you necessarily have to abstract individuals away from their unique moral and physical realities. You have to view them only from one single narrow perspective, say solely as a wage worker or solely as a legal entity.
Ignoring everything else about them.
Exactly, ignoring their unique needs, their capacities, their family responsibilities, their health, their potential, the whole person. This homogenization of human experience, this kind of flattening of moral difference just for the sake of abstract mathematical equality. That's what Marx found immoral.
So he sees equal rights as a kind of legalistic pretense, something that masks the real world inequality and difference.
Absolutely. The liberal focus on formal equality means treating people the same on paper, even when their objective life conditions, their productive capacities, their personal circumstances are vastly different. Marx argues that genuine justice, one that's actually rooted in true human flourishing, must account for these differences.
Okay.
Therefore, he concludes, and this is the radical part, that to avoid these defects, rights, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal.
Unequal rights.
Unequal rights. Only a standard that is unequal, he argues, could properly account for the morally relevant, unique differences between individuals, ensuring that everyone has the genuine opportunity to flourish, not just a formal, legal right to, say, starve equally.
Wow, that really does turn the whole liberal concept of justice completely on its head.
Oh.
And the source material highlights one final, pretty sophisticated way Marx supposedly uses Aristotle, the structural analysis of society through hylomorphism. That sounds incredibly dense.
It is advanced social theory, yeah. But once you sort of grasp the core concept of hylomorphism, which is basically Aristotle's distinction between form and matter, it offers a surprisingly powerful tool for analyzing social change and, importantly, social decay.
Form and matter in society, how does that work?
Well, Marx essentially applies this framework to society itself, treating society as a kind of organic substance. The matter, in this view, is the fundamental, almost ahistorical human trait. Productive activity, the drive to transform nature, to create, to work.
Okay, the basic human impulse to do stuff.
Kind of, yeah. And the form is the particular set of social relations that are imposed on that activity at a specific historical moment, like feudalism, or in our case, capitalism.
So human labor is the raw material, the matter, and capitalism is the imposed structure or mold, the form.
Exactly right. And this framework allows Marx to analyze social decay, which Aristotle called thora. Decay occurs when the matter becomes incongruous or sort of structurally incompatible with the form imposed on it.
Okay, so there's a mismatch.
A fundamental mismatch. In capitalism, the form, private property, the profit motive, the need for endless accumulation, restricts the matter, that spontaneous creative human labor, and forces it into these alienated channels. The worker must produce surplus value for the capitalist, which is seen as fundamentally antithetical to their intrinsic human drive for non-alienated creation and self-expression through work.
So that internal conflict, that tension between the capitalist form and the human matter it's trying to shape, that creates inherent instability. It basically makes crisis a necessary outcome of the system itself.
Precisely. The form is perpetually thwarting the potential of the matter. This inherent tension means the system is always in a state of structural decay, fragmentation, and instability. It's constantly generating contradictions. So this classical framework, this hylomorphism, provides a really devastating intellectual tool for condemning capitalism, not just as, a bad historical phase, but as a structure that is actively rotting from the inside because it degrades the very human essence it's built upon.
That definitely makes the original claim that you need Aristotle to really understand Marx seem much more academically sound, or at least understandable.
It provides that deep philosophical grounding for the critique.
Okay, that's a necessary foundation. Now, though, we have to pivot pretty sharply from that deep, almost humanistic condemnation to the cold, cynical diagnosis of modern political reality. The claim that our current system is already an oligarchy. And this is what sets the stage for that really biting critique of modern dissent.
Yes, we move from the philosophical condemnation, rooted in Aristotle, to the contemporary political reality as diagnosed by the commenter. And there is a general, almost cross-ideological consensus reflected in the source material we're looking at that Western democracies, particularly the US, are either rapidly becoming or perhaps are already functional oligarchies.
Yeah, I think we've all kind of felt that shift, haven't we? What are the key milestones or indicators that establish this oligarchic consensus in the sources? What do they point to?
Well, commentators often point to specific policy and legal shifts, particularly over the last 4 decades or so. They really emphasize the acceleration of wealth concentration starting back in the 1980s.
Reagan era.
Right, fueled by deregulation and, crucially, tax laws that disproportionately benefited the highest earners, right? The Reagan tax laws are frequently cited as a major turning point. And then this trend was sort of formalized and deeply entrenched by legal decisions like the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court case.
Which opened the floodgates for money in politics.
Essentially, yeah. It basically legalized the unlimited flow of corporate and private money into political campaigning, super PACs, that sort of thing.
So if the laws and the tax codes were shifted to benefit the wealthy, and then they were given the tools to basically fund the politicians who make and enforce those shifts, it creates this really tight, self-perpetuating cycle. The millionaire and billionaire class, as some put it, becomes the only voice that really matters in policy.
That is the widespread perception, yes. And it leads directly to this classification of the U.S. as, at best, maybe a flawed democracy, or perhaps more accurately, a functional oligarchy. But to understand the true depth of this power concentration, we need to look at that specific example of a corporate empire. Detailed in the sources, it's an illustration of vertical integration taken to an almost unbelievable extreme.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that specific kind of disturbing example of power consolidation. Lay it out for us.
All right, so imagine a single corporate entity, or perhaps a tightly interconnected network of entities that is vertically integrated across virtually every essential layer of the economy. It's quite something. This empire, let's call it, controls the raw materials, for instance, through companies dealing in things like industrial steel and supplies.
Okay, basic building blocks.
Right. Then they process those materials in-house through their own foundries and manufacture key construction components through firms they also own. Then they control the movement of all these goods through their own logistics and distribution networks, trucking companies, transport hubs.
Wait, so they control the physical stuff, the steel, the manufacturing, and the trucks that move it all around. That's incredibly foundational power right there.
It is, but they don't stop at the physical infrastructure. This power extends into the social and narrative spheres, too. They have significant investments in film production, advertising agencies, corporate signage companies.
Controlling the message.
Which gives them, as the sources explicitly note, huge propaganda potential and narrative control. They have a major hand in shaping what the public sees, what stories get told, how things are framed.
And maybe most alarmingly, this integration even touches crucial social services.
Yes, that's the final layer. Through interest in things like medical technologies, they integrate into the healthcare sector. This gives them direct influence over cost structures, delivery systems, innovation, basically direct leverage over essential social necessities. So this comprehensive, vertically integrated system controlling raw materials, distribution, production, political narrative, and social services. It's not just a collection of successful businesses. It's presented as kind of corporate-controlled economy, operating almost parallel to the state, disguised under the banner of free market capitalism.
And it's designed to ensure policy only benefits them.
That's the argument. It's structured specifically to ensure the policies only ever benefit this elite class, funding the politicians who push favorable laws, creating this incredibly powerful, almost parallel economic state within the state.
Yeah, when you lay out the system like that, the democratic process itself starts to seem almost irrelevant. Marginalized, at least. Which brings us neatly to the critical theory perspective. You mentioned Marcuse's concept of repressive tolerance, which tries to explain how this level of power concentration actually invalidates the traditional function of democracy.
Right, and what's really fascinating here and deeply paradoxical is how this intense power concentration fundamentally changes the very meaning of freedom in practice. Marcuse suggests that in a society of what he called total administration, where economic and political power are so completely integrated, like in the example we just discussed, the routine exercise of democratic liberties, voting, protesting, speaking freely, can actually end up strengthening the administration.
How on earth can freedom become an agent of repression? That sounds like the ultimate paradox.
It is, but think about it. The simple act of exercising those rights, protesting visibly on a city street, writing a critical op-ed, casting a vote in a constrained system, provides a highly visible facade of pluralism and openness.
It looks like democracy is working.
Exactly. It testifies to democratic freedoms that have, in Marcuse's critical view, changed their content and lost their effectiveness. The system can point to the protest, however ineffective, and say, see, we allow dissent. We are an open society. Freedom in this context becomes an instrument for absolving servitude. It convinces the population that they live in a free, responsive society, when in reality, the core mechanisms of power remain completely untouched and unchallenged.
So it's the spectacle of dissent, the performance of freedom, that actually helps keep the underlying repressive system stable. And you mentioned the media plays a crucial role in managing this intellectual climate.
Absolutely central. The potentially liberating force of democracy, which is effective, systemic dissent leading to real change, is blocked precisely where it needs to emerge, in autonomous critical thought and public deliberation. Under the rule of monopolistic media conglomerates, which often function as, quote, instruments of economic and political power, a certain consensus is manufactured and maintained.
Setting the terms of debate.
Pretty much. The media effectively creates a mentality where right and wrong, true and false are predefined wherever they affect the vital interests of the society. This preemptive narrative control blocks the possibility of genuine systemic deliberation. If the initial conditions of tolerance are already loaded or biased by powerful institutional interests, then that tolerance itself ends up serving a repressive function, not a liberating one.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly, almost chillingly, for the second part of that original commenter's cynical claim, the dissent paradox. If we are living in an oligarchy ruled by a total administration, then perhaps radical movements, even those inspired by the deep ethical grounding of Marx we discussed earlier, are merely creating controlled dissent that unintentionally strengthens the elite.
This is where we get into the really dark part of the argument, analyzing the concept of the ruling group mind, or RGM, as some theorists call it, and its primary containment strategy. We could label this strategy the political economy of grievance and the spectacle of resistance.
The ruling group mind sounds ominous. What is that exactly?
Think of it as the sort of strategic collective consciousness of the integrated elite, the people running that vertical corporate empire, the politicians they fund, the media outlets they influence. Its primary goal isn't necessarily progress or justice, it's survival, self-preservation. And its primary mechanism for survival isn't just crude suppression anymore, but rather managing resistance, containing it.
So the system is designed to actually absorb the energy of resistance, like a kind of systemic immune response.
That's a great analogy, exactly. This containment mechanism works to ensure the RGM's survival by carefully shaping what grievances are allowed to surface publicly and, crucially, how the resulting resistance is channeled.
So it doesn't just ignore dissent, it actively shapes it.
It absorbs the radical energy and redirects it away from fundamental structural or systemic challenges like questioning the vertical integration or the campaign finance system. Instead, that energy gets shunted toward things like symbolic activism, maybe campaigns that made people feel good but changed little, or getting absorbed into institutionalized nonprofits, or focused entirely on highly controlled electoral politics that don't actually threaten the core wealth structure.
And this mechanism actively encourages what the sources called false struggles, things that are easily consumable and, importantly, divisive.
It certainly does, and social media has become the perfect delivery mechanism for this. Algorithms are often designed to prioritize conflict, spectacle, and emotional triggers.
Outrage clicks.
Precisely. This elevates issues that generate instantaneous outrage, but might lack long-term systemic relevance or depth. Complex, difficult issues surrounding capital control or corporate power get reduced to viral outrage moments or hashtag movements that, as the analysis suggests, often burn out quickly. This prevents the sustained, deep, collective action that would actually be needed to challenge a sophisticated oligarchy.
And it keeps people arguing about the wrong things.
Furthermore, the RGM, through its media arms, actively promotes false binary choices. The constant framing of everything as simplistic left versus right to prevent people from engaging in a more systemic analysis of wealth, power, and control that cuts across those lines.
This sounds like a very sophisticated form of divide and conquer, where even genuine social struggles, like for identity or recognition, are actively co-opted and twisted into these endless culture wars.
That is identified as the core of the RGM's success in maintaining control. We could call this the political economy of social fragmentation. Genuine, often necessary struggles for identity and representation are intentionally, or at least effectively, co-opted into divisive culture wars.
How does that work?
Well, debates over issues like, say, wokeness or various forms of social recognition are actively stoked, often by media outlets aligned with elite interests, specifically to distract from wealth inequality and corporate control.
So the attention shifts away from the shared economic plight, the Aristotelian matter being thwarted by the capitalist form, and instead focuses on these superficial, often zero-sum cultural battles between different segments of the non-elite population.
Precisely. This actively pits groups against each other, preventing the formation of any real, broad-based economic class solidarity. The focus is constantly shifted away from the uncomfortable fact that a large integrated corporate empire might control your steel, your distribution networks, and your healthcare costs. Instead, the population remains atomized, isolated, and locked into conflict with each other, rather than with the elite power structures that arguably affect them all.
And Marcuse, again, seems to reinforce this by arguing that this kind of indiscriminate tolerance for every viewpoint, no matter how potentially oppressive or divisive, is actually counterproductive in achieving real change.
He does. He argues quite forcefully that tolerance cannot just be an abstract, indiscriminate virtue, particularly when political movements exist that directly contradict the very possibilities of human liberation and flourishing. If a society is already fundamentally repressive, he suggests, then indiscriminate tolerance risks serving to contain qualitative social change. Well, if the system grants equal weight, equal airtime, equal legitimacy to ideologies that are explicitly designed to reinforce servitude, inequality, and oligarchy, it simply uses the appearance of that fairness to justify its own continuation and shield itself from fundamental critique. Couple that with the powerful cultural trend towards hyper-individuation, where personal identity and subjective experience often seem to supersede collective political action, and genuine attempts at systemic change start to feel almost impossible, or at least easily sidelined.
So the end result is exactly what that cynical commenter claimed. You get this controlled descent that makes the oligarchy feel stable, maybe even look vibrant, while reinforcing the very servitude it's supposedly fighting against.
That's the bleak picture painted by this line of critique. It suggests the system is incredibly resilient in its ability to absorb and neutralize threats.
The argument is
devastatingly
pessimistic. The initial critique of capitalism, grounded in Aristotle and Marx, is sound and deeply moral. But then, any attempt to actually fight it according to this view only ends up feeding the system it opposes. Which I guess naturally leads us to the comment's final, truly startling conclusion. The solution isn't democracy, it's not revolution. It's surrender to a more functional and less oppressive form of oligarchy. What on earth is the intellectual framework that supplies this kind of radically anti-democratic proposal?
This is the final and perhaps most controversial ideological leap. It takes us into the territory of the Dark Enlightenment, or DE, sometimes called the Neo-Reactionary Movement, or NRX. This is a school of thought that, while maybe obscured to the general public, has apparently gained significant traction among certain tech and financial elites.
The Dark Enlightenment, or DE. Just the name sounds like an explicit rejection of, well, everything the modern West is supposedly built upon.
And it absolutely is. It represents a total, unapologetic rejection of core Enlightenment ideals. Democracy, equality, universal liberty, the rule of law as commonly understood, and even the general belief in linear societal progress. It emerged primarily from influential online forums and blogs, spearheaded by intellectual figures like Curtis Yarvin, who wrote under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, and the philosopher Nick Land.
Okay, so what's their core argument against democracy?
They argue, essentially, that liberal democracy is inherently inefficient, bureaucratic, prone to mob rule or mediocrity, and fundamentally incapable of solving complex, high-stakes, long-term problems effectively. It's seen as decadent and decaying.
So they advocate for a system based purely on efficiency and competence, not messy participatory governance. What form does that supposed efficiency take in their proposals?
They advocate for radical, hierarchical, often explicitly authoritarian systems. Their ideal replacement for democracy isn't usually specified in minute detail, but the general theme is a non-democratic system led by highly competent, perhaps genetically or intellectually superior hybrid figures. Yarvin sometimes evokes a CEO meets monarch-like figure.
A CEO king.
Something like that. Yarvin, as Moldbug, famously advocated replacing national democracies altogether with for-profit sovereign corporations, essentially applying corporate governance principles directly to the nation's state. Government as a business run for profit and efficiency by a CEO ruler.
That is basically corporate feudalism on a national scale.
Wow. And how do they view established institutions like the media, universities, the civil service?
They are viewed as a primary obstacle to implementing this vision of efficient, rational rule. They collectively label these institutions, which they see as enforcing a kind of progressive or liberal dogma that stifles real competence, the cathedral.
Yes. And the cathedral, in their view, must be dismantled or bypassed. Yarvin, for instance, went so far as to propose a specific radical action plan called RAGE, which stood for Retire All Government Employees.
Retire all government employees.
The idea was to essentially reboot the U.S. government by clearing out the entire existing administrative bureaucracy and replacing it with a streamlined, perhaps privatized, corporate-style management structure accountable only to the CEO ruler.
This isn't just some fringe internet philosophy, though, is it? You mentioned elite alignment. Are we seeing clear connections between these DE concepts and powerful figures in the real world?
Absolutely. This has moved beyond obscure blogs. We have prominent Silicon Valley figures who have openly flirted with or endorsed these kinds of ideas. Peter Thiel is probably the most famous example. He has explicitly stated that he believes freedom and democracy are incompatible, signaling a clear preference for more efficient, perhaps authoritarian forms of governance, which he often links, approvingly, to concepts like corporate feudalism.
And Yarvin himself.
Yarvin, in turn, has been widely acknowledged, sometimes described almost as the house political philosopher for key technology investors and figures in that world. This illustrates how this seemingly radical ideology has moved from the fringes into elite drawing rooms and influences strategic thinking.
Okay, so the logical consequence of embracing this ideology is the push for direct control of governance by technocrats, by the tech elite themselves.
That is the ultimate practical application, yes. The DE approach manifests in this growing desire for, and sometimes the actual implementation of, direct control by tech elites over foundational government functions. Initiatives like the potential establishment of a Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which was championed at one point by figures like Elon Musk.
Right, I remember that.
These exemplify the desire to dismantle what they see as the slow, inefficient, democratic federal bureaucracy and replace it with agile, technology-driven control wielded by a small number of supposedly hyper-competent elites.
And technology itself, specifically things like AI and mass surveillance, must be absolutely central to managing the population without the perceived burden of democratic accountability.
It's the engine that makes the better oligarchy seem feasible, even attractive to its proponents. The DE vision relies heavily on replacing messy, human participatory politics with opaque, data-driven algorithmic rule.
Government by algorithm.
Essentially. This means delegating core governance functions to AI systems, think predictive policing algorithms, automated welfare distribution systems, resource allocation determined by data models, all likely controlled or designed by private corporations accountable to the elite, not the public. These systems replace democratic accountability with what is perceived by proponents as rational, optimized, data-driven rule. The underlying argument is basically that data knows best, and the citizens simply need to be managed efficiently for their own good.
And even seemingly progressive concepts like universal basic income, UBI, could be viewed critically through this particular lens.
Indeed. While UBI might be proposed by some on the left as a progressive measure to alleviate poverty, critical scholars looking at the DE movement see it quite differently. They view it as potentially an accelerationist strategy to pacify the population while consolidating power in the hands of the few.
Pacification through subsistence.
The idea being, if the masses are provided with basic subsistence through UBI, but simultaneously lose all meaningful political agency and democratic control, then the consolidation of authoritarian technocratic control becomes simpler, more efficient, and far less prone to potentially violent dissent or revolution. Keep people fed but powerless.
So this entire push for corporate authoritarianism, often masked rhetorically as just the pursuit of efficiency and competence, is ultimately seen by critics as a deliberate strategy. A strategy to solidify elite power and actually exacerbate existing inequality.
That is the essential takeaway from critically analyzing this better oligarchs proposal. This relentless focus on speed, optimization, and efficiency isn't viewed as merely pragmatic problem-solving. It's interpreted by critics as a deliberate strategy to exacerbate inequality, ensuring that power remains permanently concentrated within a privileged technological and financial elite. The ultimate goal, in this critical view, is entrenching elite dominance under the guise of rational optimization, rather than serving any broad societal progress or, certainly, the Aristotelian ideal of human-centered governance we started with.
It's quite a journey we've traced, this strange, almost sprawling argument starting from the rigorous, humanistic, philosophical grounding of Marx via Aristotle, all the way to this pragmatic, almost anti-humanist surrender to a technocratic dictatorship. It's incredibly powerful, perhaps, because of its dark internal coherence.
The synthesis is stark, isn't it?
Yes.
And deeply unsettling. That initial academic call to arms, grounded in Aristotle and Marx, provides this profound humanist philosophy against alienation and for genuine human flourishing. It condemns the capitalist form for throttling human potential.
The moral high ground.
Exactly. Yet the subsequent cynical claims suggest that modern power structures, the functional oligarchy, the ruling group mind, the mechanisms of repressive tolerance are so pervasive, so effective at managing dissent, that any attempt to resist within the current framework only strengthens the system through controlled dissent and spectacle.
Dropped.
Which leads the commenter, and those who think like them, to their final, deeply pessimistic leap. The only realistic alternative left is to give up on democracy and revolution, and instead just surrender to better oligarchs, demanding only functional authoritarian efficiency in return.
The source material, this whole line of argument, really forces us to confront this ultimate tension, doesn't it? The core struggle exposed here seems to be the ultimate moral choice for society right now. Do we prioritize the messy, fragile, often inefficient, yet fundamentally valuable pursuit of human rights, dignity, and participatory democracy? Or do we surrender to the allure of rule by the technological elite in the name of functional, frictionless, authoritarian efficiency?
And the material makes it chillingly clear that this isn't some abstract future threat debated in seminars. It's presented as an active, shaping political force, an ideology influencing investment, policy proposals, and potentially determining the very nature of governance today and tomorrow.
It really brings into focus that historical context, too.
Yes, and what's fascinating and perhaps telling is how the historical efficacy of, say, post-World War II Western economic policies, characterized by relatively high taxation on the wealthy, significant public works, strong unions, things that demonstrably did mitigate wealth concentration for several decades, how that history is largely ignored by this new philosophy.
That model worked to an extent.
It certainly offered a different path within a democratic framework. Yet the political philosophy we've just unpacked, the one advocating for corporate feudalism and better oligarchs, seems to propose a surrender to elite control as the only viable path forward, almost erasing that memory of successful democratic intervention in the economy.
So the final thought for you, the listener, might be this. Are the lessons of past democratic successes being willfully ignored or erased, perhaps, to better justify the current concentration of technological and economic power and the push towards a more authoritarian future? It's a heavy question, but one this deep dive forces us to consider.